We had two fantastic panels in the morning, and as the day progresses, we touch upon different areas of this 3T summit, technology, transfer pricing, and transparency. As I mentioned in my opening remarks yesterday, and in our keynote panel, we looked at the extent of dispute resolution in India, and the statistics are mind-boggling. But how dispute resolution is being approached now with the additional dispute resolution mechanism platforms available, and to touch upon range of issues, we have a fantastic panel over here. Please give a big hand to our panel. Please give a big hand to our panel over here, please. Thank you. Louder, please. So the topic of the panel discussion is past, present, and future of dispute resolution. The panel will be moderated by Bipin Pawar. We also have Mr. Mahesh Kumar, APA Commissioner on the panel. We have Mr. Shobhan Kar, Director, Foreign Tax Division, CBDT. We also have two industry stalwarts here, Mr. Sunil Dhareshwar, who is a Senior Vice President, Group Head, Global Taxation and Corporate Accounting, Infosys, and Mr. Karthikeya Dubey, who is a VP Tax at British Petroleum. And last but not the least, we have dear friend Sanjay Tolia, who is a partner with PwC. He heads the Asia Pacific transfer pricing team for PwC and heads the market team for PwC India. Let me also briefly introduce our panel moderator and Bipin, and then leave the proceedings to him. Bipin is a senior transfer pricing partner with PwC based in Mumbai. He leads Mumbai region transfer pricing business for PwC India. He has over 22 years experience in dealing with range of tax, investment, transaction structuring matters, optimizing benefits for income tax and tax treaties, addressing regulatory issues and tax compliance. Since 2001, with the introduction of TP regulations in India, Bipin has been advising clients on innovative TP opportunities and strategies, combining industry's insights, technical skills to provide holistic solutions. Bipin, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for that very long introduction. I think two lines would have been very enough. So dear friends, we have a very distinguished panel over here, and what we wanted to cover in the next 1.5 hours or so is how the journey of Indian transfer pricing has been. We started that journey in 2001, and as you all know, in the first few years of transfer pricing, the approach of taxpayers, the approach of consultants, and also of the revenue authorities was mostly to look at margins and so on. So, but there has been a sea change. So with time, the wave of litigations came. We saw humongous amount of litigation in India. The APA program was launched. As of today, more than 220 APAs have been inked. So we've come a long way. We've reached a stage where India was a key participant in the entire BEPS project run by the G20 and the OECD. With this stupendous change, what we wanted to talk today is what do we think is the present of dispute resolution, and going forward, what if we were to put down a wish list of how one should deal with dispute resolution and how we should plan our affairs in a manner that disputes do not happen. That's the area that we're going to try and talk about. So, I'll start by asking a question to the industry. That Karthik, do you think transfer pricing litigation in India has gone down now over the years, or do you think we are still where we were some years ago, in general?
So I think. It's a maturing process on both sides, and I think more and more people going towards APA and the safe harbor does mean that the trajectory is lower. There'll always be one-offs which are there, but I think sort of the general trajectory for this litigation is lower, and I think that's not only because of transfer pricing litigation or in relation to transfer pricing. But today, from a Companies Act and SEBI point of view also, there is a lot more scrutiny and disclosure around related party transactions. So it's also a governance issue, and therefore companies have had last 2-3 years to align their related party transactions. And that's also responsible for it, not just tax.
So Sunil, when we started with transfer pricing 16, 17 years ago, as I mentioned, the focus of taxpayers, revenue authorities, consultants, the transfer pricing was mainly compliance, and it was implemented by looking at margins and benchmarking. Do you feel that in the manner in which transfer pricing is today approached, both by the industry as well as by the revenue authorities in audits, we are now moving to an issue-based approach to transfer pricing, as opposed to just simply margin-based?
I think if you look at transfer pricing from an industry perspective, things have changed and evolved. There have been some, industries or some companies who've, traditionally also looked at transfer pricing not from a perspective of just managing the tax. It's always been reflective of what kind of functions have been performed, what kind of assets, which is what a traditional transfer pricing, was always, set out to be. So I think for some organizations who have always followed that in terms of having structures which are reflective of what the business reality is, things have remained the same. But for others who have looked at transfer pricing as a tool of managing their effective tax rate, definitely things have changed. Given authorities have come down heavily in terms of using transfer pricing for managing, effective tax rates, that has now gone away. And now it is more specific on, issues that you would have, whether it is, royalty payment which you may have, or whether it is in terms of, expenses relating to, marketing or advertising and things like that. The other thing which I'd like to also mention is that for us who pretty much operate, from just an Indian perspective, I think we've been fairly hard in terms of saying that, there have been significant issues around transfer pricing. The reality is not that. Across the world, transfer pricing is something which has gained momentum, be it in Europe or, things perhaps in like Australia. We are seeing a lot more action happening from the tax authorities. So I think the world over, transfer pricing is something which is now a hot topic for organizations that are operating, outside of India as well.
Right. But do you believe that the days of using transfer pricing as a tool for managing the effective tax rate, are those days over, or do you feel that there might be a limited window to still do that, provided your profit outcomes are aligned with where value is created, and within the four corners, if you plan your taxes, that still should be okay?
No, I don't think so. I think, it'll all catch up. You might feel good and comfortable that you've managed to snook the tax authorities, today, but it's only a matter of time. And the reality is, you might set up structures thinking that things are working fine, and you can't sit in your offices and, assume that you will ask business to do things in a particular manner. And when you look at it, 2 years down the line, things would have fallen apart. So that's not going to work. I think at the long term, it's not something that anyone will succeed. You have to be realistic. You have to, follow what the business is. There are things where you can, engage with business. If there are alternate options in terms of doing business in a particular way, then you can recommend and suggest, what would be the tax outcome, if at all. But you will eventually have to look at what has been implemented on the ground by the business, on the manner in which, you are doing your activities, whether it is being a sales function, whether it is being a manufacturing, and then you will have to reflect your transfer pricing accordingly. It cannot be the other way around.
So maneuvering around profit margins cannot be the only driver. But if profit outcomes get allocated to where the actual functions are, and that helps you manage better transfer pricing, and along the process, if it helps you reduce your ETR, then that's the way to go.
Yeah, see, just so that I'm clear, Gone are the days when you could, set up an IP in, some jurisdictions in, Manofile or something like that, and then, try and do your, marketing, or you can do your contracting for the day. Gone are the days where you could, set up something in Singapore, and then you have a sales and marketing in Australia, and then you have all your contracting happening between Singapore and Australia. Gone are the days. You will need to ensure that you will have to have your, sales and marketing. If it has to happen from Singapore, and then you have your client in Australia. You cannot have this structure where you have your people on the ground, be it within Ireland or UK. You can't have an IP sitting in Ireland, and you can't have your sales folks sitting in the UK and then engaging with the customer. And when the final contracting comes, you ask your client in the UK to sign with your Ireland entity. You cannot do that anymore. And with more and more information now being available, and what I would call as, people talking about tax openly, it is something that you cannot hide behind, structures which you think will not be, opened apart.
If I just give a different perspective, that the world around us is not allowing us to do what we want to do, okay? So this conversation, in my mind, is just gone. Let me give 2 examples. So let's say we have planned a transfer. We started the business, and the year is going by. 2 examples I want to give you, which totally changes the whole transpricing, and you have no control on it. Take the recent example. Trump has put in tariffs on steel and aluminum products imported into the US, and specific tariffs for Chinese imports. As a retaliation, India has increased the tariffs, China has increased the tariffs, and EU has increased the tariffs. Just imagine you planned something, thinking something on 1st April 2018, and the whole world of transfer pricing changes because of these tariffs, because it impacts the transfer pricing for income tax, it impacts the transfer pricing for customs. Second example, Brexit becomes applicable in 18 months from now. A huge amount of tariff is going to be on products which are imported from UK into EU.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa. What does it do to your transfer pricing? So I think the external environment impact into tax is so phenomenal that you may not even have the time or the liberty to think about any tax planning, because you need to plan more for this business exigencies than anything else.
So Sunil, I want to ask you this question. In today's time, when there is so much change happening around us, laws are getting amended every few months. We've seen so much change in the last 2 years in India, GST, Companies Act, the whole wave around BEPS. In this era of uncertainty, how does Infosys as a corporate approach business decisions, and how tax plays a role in your internal thinking?
Yeah, so I think first of all, one of the welcome things that is there is the changes that are happening in the tax regulations. I think that's welcome, because earlier, it was always used to be a catch-up game. Regulations were not clear, business was changing rapidly, and you had to form tax, views or positions, not knowing, what the regulations would come in later. So from that perspective, I'm happy that the manner and the pace at which the regulations are changing, there's still a gap. I think, business will always be a little bit ahead. And then there will be a lag for the regulations to catch up, but that gap is reducing. I think from that perspective, it is a bit helpful when you look at what kind of tax policies that you want to have and tax structures that you want to set up. From a Infosys perspective, if you were to look at it, I think we've traditionally been what I would call as, we would not do anything which is very aggressive. Our structures are fairly simple. There's nothing which we set up in terms of having an IP holding company or things of that sort. The other thing that has helped us is the structure that we have, which is a branch model. A little unique from most other organizations where you have subsidiaries across different jurisdictions. So having a branch setup has helped us tremendously. But having said that, we still need to deal with a lot of tax issues, as in what is the kind of margins that you need to offer to tax in the overseas jurisdiction, because still you need to file your overseas returns. But so you end up having to deal not more on a bilateral basis, but more on a unilateral basis with the tax authorities. From a tax structuring, tax policy perspective, we've always followed what the business has been doing. There's nothing that we would set up and say, if you do a structure in a particular manner, that would give us a tax benefit. It is more in terms of letting the business go ahead and formulate the way in which they want to set up the business operations, and then follow through from a tax perspective in terms of how the pricing has to be done. So that's what we've followed, and I think it's worked well, and it's kind of helped us in the long run.
Karthik, would you like to add something to that from a BP point of view?
Yeah, so I think, I second everything Sunil has said, because transfer pricing does not drive business, at least tax transfer pricing does not. Business drives business. Yeah. I think all you need to do is be aware that there may be some red flags that you can't do. Just for example, concessionaire arrangements is a problem. But really what matters is that the business substance should happen and it should be documented in real time. And if you can provide the business some tools to do that, because they want to focus on business, not documenting it in that sense, then you can't worry about what will happen at assessment or what will happen at DRP or tribunal. If you have done the right thing from a business point of view and you have documented it, eventually you will get the right outcome, because your intention was to do what is best for business. So I would still say, let's not forget that these are rules to allocate transfer pricing from a tax perspective. But the real transfer pricing is what business does and what follows value, right? And as long as you have that and that's documented, it's difficult to challenge that, because you're the one doing the business, and therefore you know what the value is and where it is. Nobody else can tell you that better than yourself, because that's what's successful in the market.
And proactively engaging with the revenue, whether it's the income tax authorities or indirect tax authorities, that has its own value in terms of communicating the corporate side of the story of things, right?
Yeah, so absolutely proactively engaging, but let's understand how can you do that. I think in India we'll probably get to that kind of mechanism, but if you look at the Netherlands, for example, you have a concurrent audit sort of framework or a concurrent assessment sort of framework. You can catch up with them when a transaction is happening, or you can catch up with them every quarter. And that gives you real-time feedback of, where the red flags are. But, sort of one of the golden rules is, if you're going to ask a question, then you probably know the answer. Okay. Right? So I think you have to be realistic with yourself, and, you're just seeking to confirm, what you may know in many ways. If there is a genuine area of sort of disagreement or doubt, then that helps. So, in my mind, talking to a tax authority is no different from getting an opinion. Why do you do that? From an advisor. Sorry, I know you didn't want that, but...
No, I think I want to second that, because it's good to be proactive, but it should also, mean that there is something in it for you as well. It's not helpful just having a discussion without getting anything in, as confirmatory. And we've just started off on the GST side with trying to get, the same APA program and all of that. But that's where it is. So if you approach an authority and engage, and if there is a particular view that is given, then, they should be able to stand behind it and give it to you in writing. It doesn't help in terms of just having a discussion and then, both people, walk different ways, and then when you come back, then the view is different, it changes. So then that's not helpful. For it to be successful, it has to be collaborative, and then it should be something that can be, put pen to paper and have it signed, and that's when, it helps in the long run.
Right. let's move to the APA program. I think the program has received tremendous success. Now we've finished 5 years of the program. We've finished 5 years of the program, and in these 5 years, while in the first 3 years progress was a little slow because we just had one APA commissioner, and then the government has ramped up the resources that are there. We have 3 APA commissioners in the country, and as things stand today, there are over 220 APAs that have been inked and close to 20 bilaterals within that. I understand that today we are at a stage where the fastest disposals in the world are happening in India. So by and large, if you look at the stories of other governments, they put out statistics as well. The number of APs that we have inked in the last 2.5 years, I don't think any other country would have done that. So what I wanted to understand from Shobhan is, could you, I mean, the statistics are there in the public domain, but would you like the audience to know broadly what kind of APAs have been inked? I mean, a large number of APAs have been cost plus service markup type of APAs, but apart from that, what kind of APAs have been inked?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. As Bipin has said, the APA program has really picked up pace in the last 2.5 years. But largely, you see, out of 220, if you ask me, more than 60 or 70% cases would be in the domain of software development, ITS, and cost plus markups. But we have done very many good and complex cases in the recent past, including an issue as complex as AMP. I mean, it came out in some media quarters also. We are doing royalty cases, we have done variable royalty, we have done manufacturing, distribution, and recently we resolved some cases with Denmark just 2 weeks back. They have not been inked yet. They were very difficult cases, and you would be pleased to know that within a span of 2 years, we have closed those APs. And that in the first meeting with our counterparts in Denmark. So a lot of homework goes into these bilateral APs, of course into unilateral APs also, but here you have to deal with the other competent authority. So we do a lot of interaction with them through email, telephone calls. These are all the back office kind of work that we keep on doing. So the taxpayer may not be aware of the kind of engagement we have with our counterparts. Our relationship with most of the treaty partners is top-notch at this time, be it Japan, Australia, US, of course, our biggest bilateral APA partner.
Right.
So I think bilateral APAs are picking up pace. We'll have many more bilateral applications coming in. We are close to 200 applications now. That includes fresh and conversions. Once US opened its bilateral APA program, the conversions started happening.
Right.
So all in all, the APA program, personally, I have been associated with APA from 2012. So it's been 6 years. It's a very fruitful journey, a lot of learning for all of us there. And I think it is the single most successful program of the CBDT. I can put that on record. And but we still have some catching up to do. We need more resources, more trained people in the APA space, because as of now, we have received almost 1,000 applications. So while we have done 220, which is phenomenal, just imagine the pressure on us to dispose more APAs. And I would encourage taxpayers and consultants to keep engaged with us. And I mean, we'll talk during the next 40, 50 minutes. There are a lot of things that can help the APAs get inked quicker. And we'll talk about that.
So Mahesh Kumar sir, my question to you is, as you deal with taxpayers, as you deal with consultants in the APA program, what would be your advice to taxpayers in terms of how they should prepare their cases when they come for a discussion? And as a tax authority, what would be your expectation from the taxpayers that are coming to you for APAs? Because one way to look at it is that the earlier APAs that were filed in 2013, 2014, some of them are not yet signed. And obviously, a lot needs to be done on the taxpayer side as well to show more diligence, more proactiveness. But if you can share with the audience what has been your experience and what would be your advice to taxpayers?
Good morning, everyone. Generally, the experience has been very nice, and we've been able to send quite a good number of position papers in which the APAs would be signed very shortly. There have been a few hiccups in the sense that many a times the APA team comes up with some questionnaire, and if the applicant says, okay, sir, we require a time of 1 month, fine. But then he should respond in 1 month. If he doesn't respond, and if the team, you see, we are so much pressed with cases, will not follow up. And then the case gets a bit derailed. Then after 2 months or 3 months, if he comes again, one has to go through the entire facts. Then only a fruitful discussion will happen. So the first thing what I feel is that there should be continuous interaction, and the submission should be fast. So that will ease up both from the revenue side as well as the applicant side to dispose of the application easily. Okay. That is one. Strange instances have been on surface where the feel that we have is the applicant is not filing the desired information which it should have filed. Then the point I'm trying to say is that basically APA program is program based on transparency and trust. So there should be complete transparency, there should be complete trust that whatever you are sharing with us, we will use it to solve the issue, nothing beyond that. So that thing has to develop. Right. At places, the gut feeling is that the applicant doesn't come up with the information. And another thing could be like, the replies at times are very technical. If you ask, what is the commercial rationale for this? You say you've done it, but what is the commercial rationale? Because you're doing business. So for any transaction, there has to be some commercial rationale. And if the answer to that doesn't come, then at times there is a time which is being taken. So I think, as I mentioned, if the applicant comes up with the replies in a timely manner. And yes, one more thing. If you feel that a particular query that we have asked may not be relevant, come and discuss. We are open. And if you are having a problem, in fact, this is what I have done in a few cases. The councils, they came to me, they said, sir, this information may not be available with us. Then I explained to them the rationale of why this information is wanted, then in what other form the same information can be given. Right. So once there's a dialogue, the things will speeden up. So these are small, some things which I thought would help.
That's a very interesting point, because in the course of APAs, sometimes, and this is general experience across the country, sometimes we do see long questionnaires being issued. Sometimes the questions would run into 60 questions, 70 questions. And I think what you rightly said is it would help if taxpayers and their consultants engage with the department, walk through the questions, understand the rationale for those questions, and maybe sometimes if some questions are seen to be irrelevant, there should be a conversation around those questions, and that's how it will help taxpayers to respond quickly, as quickly as they reasonably can. Yeah.
Just share one positive interaction which I had with Maheshji. So we had this example of 60 questions, and so I engaged with him that do we really need all these answers? And he made a very interesting point, and it stayed with me. And it's not the first time, it's happened earlier also, that when you look at a transaction, and he was talking about the commercial rationale, you know everything about the transaction. We don't know anything about the transaction. So we would ask you 15 questions, assuming it almost covers comprehensively the complete story of that transaction. We may still have missed out a few questions, but those 15 questions are to get a complete story of that transaction. How did it start? What was the commercial rationale? What was the business perspective, etc. The day I had that conversation, those 15 questions for that transaction reduced to 2 or 3, because the clarity was there, that what you want to understand and what we need to give. I realized we answer 15 questions one by one, and if they don't still tell you the complete story, we will still have another 15 questions. And that's what he told me, that you will still have another 15 questions, Sanjay, if you don't come and give me the right story. I said, here is the story.
So that is exactly the point I'm trying to say. You see, once you interact, you will come to know that what is the purpose that a particular question is being asked. If the complete information comes, those 15 questions will be reduced to 2 or 3. So your compliance level immediately drops.
Right.
And that solves the problem.
Yeah, so just I want to kind of bring in a perspective of some of the ways that we've had experience outside of India, and it'll help to kind of understand whether it's similar in India or not from yourself. But I'm also going to say something which may be controversial. At least what we do is that we don't use consultants to a large extent. We kind of tend to deal with the tax authorities directly, and that gives, as far as the the revenue authorities get a lot more comfort when they speak to us directly. There are countries like in Europe that we do have to use consultants because of language issues. And there are times when we use consultants because it might be a technical issue, whether when you want to do a benchmarking and all of that. But when it comes to the business operations, there is a direct one-on-one interaction. We went through a transfer pricing assessment in Australia, and we had our chief delivery officer who is in Australia as part of our team. So he was with us. He was explaining the way the business operates. It wasn't even us as in the tax team who were talking to the tax authorities. We got our head of business to be there along with us. We actually took through the authorities the way our systems work. We actually showed them what kind of technology that we have in the system. How do you get an SOW sign? How does that go into the system? How do we allocate our employees to a particular project? What is the manner in which you look at a project delivery? How does the billing happen? How does that go into SAP? So we actually took them through the actual technology and the systems that we use in the business. And we had the business people sitting and engaging with the tax authorities. And I think that's very helpful on two fronts, because that gives a lot of trust as far as the authorities are concerned. And it also ensures that there is that open, honest communication that you have with the authorities, and it cuts down a lot of time. Because what happens is, by doing this, we also cut down the number of questions that you get from the authorities, because it's pretty much walking through the way the business, the way it is. The second element which is there is, in some of these countries, there's a very particular, a calendar or a particular, roadmap that is given. It says that the first 2 months there will be an engagement. There'll be questions and there is a commitment on both sides. There is a commitment from the taxpayer and the tax authorities as to timelines in terms of, when a question will be sent out, when will the response come in, when will you have these, discussions with a face-to-face or over a VC, when will they give a draft response, when do you respond to it, and then, when do you conclude. There is also a mechanism of escalation. If you believe that what you're engaging with the field is not working, you have what they call as a taxpayer, right, which you can further escalate to even to the commissioner level, where you see something is not moving, or if you think that, things are, hitting a roadblock. And the last element which you also have is the fact that, what Sanjay mentioned, that you can engage with the tax authorities and ask them as to why they're asking, questions. And the tax authorities are very open in terms of trying to say, what is the purpose of asking, some of the questions. We had an issue where, the tax authorities were asking for data for a particular year, which was more recent, which would have taken us a little more time in providing to it. And the tax authorities were very flexible in saying, if it is not for this year, give us for a prior year, which was already available. So there is a lot more flexibility that you see when you engage with the authorities in terms of the cooperation that you get from all sides.
All the 4 points that you raised is present in our APA program also, like the site visits, the understanding the business. We have had a number of joint site visits in bilateral APAs. That has, in the earlier session, they were talking about joint audits. Well, joint audit is still slightly way off for India, but joint site visits have yielded tremendous results when competent authorities of both countries have sat down with the business and understood what functions are being performed and how things happen in that business. In fact, we have done it in other countries also. It's not that competent authorities from foreign are coming here. We have done it in UK,
Including one which we did in UK.
Yeah, and we are planning to have some site visits in US also. So that helps a lot. Regarding flexibility, I think the APA teams in India have shown tremendous flexibility around what questions are being asked, what is the rationale behind these questions. In fact, I would say that we have found many a times creative solutions to some problematic areas, which in a normal TP audit was not possible. And the example of that is we have been using other methods in a number of APAs. So other method itself gives you enough flexibility to price a transaction. So I think when we started with the APA program, it was a leap of faith. And the leap of faith has to be from both sides. So when Sir points out that in some cases, the answers are probably not enough or not appropriate, the positive takeaway is that taxpayers should come and place all their cards on the table. And we assure you that the APA commissioners and the APA teams, right from day one, have been very open and frank and forthright with the taxpayers. So this is one program where both sides need to, it takes two to tango, we say. So that has been the hallmark of this program, and let us continue that way.
Yeah. So I'll just add a slightly different version from what Sunil said. So I think if you're going for an APA, like I said, it's a leap of faith from both sides. But the fact is that if you're making an application, it's an application to get certainty, which means that you are saying you're committed to it. So at that point, then you can't change your mind whether you are or you are not. So let me just take this from a non-transfer pricing scenario. Suppose, you're in a listed company and there's a board meeting and then there's an analyst presentation. There are briefing packs for all the board members interacting with everybody, right? You know the 10, 20 questions that the analyst will ask. Now, if you use an advisor, you know that in those type of transactions, a list of 50 or 60, those are fairly common questions. What stops you from when you file the application and the first time you meet the authority from actually preparing those 60 questions and taking them across? Don't you do that in other places? Because we found in our experience that when you prepare for it that way, you're making your application and your stuff a lot more robust. And so we had some interactions where in 2 meetings we closed very complex issues because we came with questions and then we even shared that openly because, let's not forget, we are the ones who initiated that and they are trying to understand it. So, why this back and forth that I'll file, then you'll ask, then I'll reply? Of course, you can't guess every question and some may or may not be relevant. But I think proactive preparation is part of the engagement process. If you want it fast, then you have to put in effort accordingly.
So Shobhan, we see instances in today's life where, taxpayers have inked APAs and then they want to rely on those APAs in past years' litigation, which may not be covered in a rollback. So on the one hand, it does have the effect of, managing a dispute or closing a dispute sometimes, but how would you respond to that? Do you think that's a desirable trait?
I mean, there's nothing undesirable about that, but you see, the only thing which I would, generally it happens at the level of the tribunal. So my only, I hope that when the tribunal applies the same markup, because that has been the trend, not only in APAs, even MAP resolutions have been, similar markups have been applied to transactions not covered under the MAP resolution. The only thing which, I don't know whether the taxpayers are putting it forth to the benches, that, in an APA, it's not just the markup. We have a number of other conditions which need to be fulfilled. We have critical assumptions, we have definitions of cost base, what should be in the cost. See, suppose I'm applying a 15% markup on 100, that gives me a different result than applying the 15% on a cost base which was much truncated. These things should also be looked at, and I think the basic point would be that when the similar results are given out, the FAR should at least be testified to be the same. Similar. Otherwise, there's no point in applying. I have no quarrel with the taxpayer taking the APA or MAP resolution to the tribunal.
Okay.
I'll add one thing over here. It should be a two-way process then, in the sense that, well, yes, the applicant is free to use it. Should the revenue also use it? That's a thing to be thought.
No, I think it's a very valid point. Because at the end of the day, it is a private agreement. It's a private agreement. I was actually asking the question from that point of view.
No, but the parties are the same, right? Even for the past.
Okay.
The argument may come that it should not be put to the. If it is beneficial, I put it up.
Right.
The revenue could not put it up because
That's
they
the
have
point
gone
that
by
you
the
make. It has to be a two-way street. It can't be convenient.
So the things will gradually shape because that's the judicial trend which is starting up. So I think this will gradually shape up a particular policy as to what has to be done.
Right. And we do see that trend in international case laws also, where sometimes the taxpayer would have relied on APAs in other years, and they would cite that in a court of law.
So I don't know how prevalent it is, because if I remember correctly, there has been only one reference to us in the CBDT from CITDR, that the taxpayer is coming and flashing the APA here. Could we get some information to argue the case? So we had some engagement.
Okay.
Otherwise than that, there has never been anyone approaching us saying that the taxpayer is using it. So I really don't know what is the prevalence of this.
Okay.
There are at least 4 or 5 APAs which have been referred in the tribunal. I recently wrote an article and it is there.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
And in fact, I have raised this issue that the day is not far when the revenue will start using the APA for their benefit.
But I don't see that as an issue because the principles are kind of the same, and if the definitions of the state are similar, then it's an opportunity on both sides.
I think the markups can vary from
principle-based situation.
across 2 years, but the principle at least should follow.
No, but I think like what Shobhan was saying.
The process is different. In APA or the issue is the process is different. APA, it is a across the table give and take. We do not know because end output is reflected in the margin that is adopted. Now, since there are certain tribunal judgments in the public domain, in those cases they were adopted. But if you look at 95% was covered by the transaction, 5% was not there. But if you look at the totality of the 5%, that is, say, 200 crores. If that is 200 crores, that, I mean, in those times, 5 crore and 15 crore limit was there, that there would have been 12 cases, separate audits would have been taking place. So those are the issues, and ultimately, the rationale and what principles were applied is not known. So therefore, whether it will be feasible to adopt it straight-jacketed, that's the issue, I think Ajit also raised.
No, I think the point is, if the facts are the same in terms of, functions, assets, everything else, if it is similar, I don't see any reason why it cannot be used for something which is in the past, because there are places where you do have rollbacks of, APA and all of that. If the dispute remains the same, if the issue remains the same, it's only the quantums might be different, but if the underlying facts are the same, I would fail to understand why you would want to agree for something, in similar manner for the future, but not accept it for the past.
I mean, it's only an option. Can I just add quickly a comment here? It's very difficult to take an APA period, whatever has come, and then apply it to past years as an outcome in itself. I would agree with the reservations that are being raised here. If there is a fundamental principle that has come out, or more than the principle, even if certain facts have come out, right? If there is a characterization that has been agreed, that is something you can take back. But the outcome itself, if that's a percentage, that's a markup, that's a difficult one.
I agree with you on that. I was about to, amend what I was saying or modifying to the extent if there is, your comparables if you're taking, right? So, for example, if you agree on the comparables, which are, possibly the 5 comparables which are there, and assuming those comparables were doing the same thing in the past, but if the margins were different, let me finish. So, if the margins were different, then you'll have to modify it to that extent. You can't possibly use the same margins what you've agreed for the past. Yeah. So you will have to do, some amount of tweaking, but the underlying facts have to be the same so that you can make those relevant adjustments.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I would favor borrowing the facts that have been agreed, because that's usually the biggest area of dispute that we get into, right? Because we don't agree on the facts. APA allows that forum, open forum, to bring everything on the table and agree on a certain fact of patent fact pattern. which can then be taken back.
So that's what I was saying. So if you have agreed on, for in the most times you have a dispute is in terms of who is your comparable, right? That's where you go on back and forth. The taxpayer has a set of comparable, the tax authorities have a different set of comparables. But if you're able to agree on, that set, then you can use possibly the same set for the past, but look at what the outcome was for those comparables and use, accordingly the way, those, things results.
So unlike overseas APAs, Sunil, the Indian APAs, we don't agree on the comparable set in the APA. So there is a difference here.
Okay. Let's talk about the upcoming CBCR audits. A lot of people are anxious about how these audits are going to happen. Is that something that people should be worried about? There is a fair bit of apprehension about the upcoming CBCR audits. So my question to Karthik is, one is as a corporate, how should the industry prepare for an upcoming CBCR audits? And the context in which I'm asking this question is, the first round of filings have already been completed. And before the filings could be done, there was a window available to make corrections. So if you found that, some corrections were warranted in some country, the margins are not right, or agreements are not in place, then you had a window available to make those corrections. But now that the filings have been done, from this point onwards, how should companies prepare for this?
So I won't speak to this more in detail, but because I think that's something Soban sir will refer to. But what is a CBCR audit? I'm not aware of a concept like that.
No, it's a regular audit.
Sorry, just to state the obvious, I don't mean to, right? So you have your current transfer pricing, and again, I don't want to step into what he's going to describe, but eventually that remains the forum you have to deal with. At the back end, whatever information is available, and how they will go about that, he will describe. So if you're preparing for your transfer pricing audits, you have filed your CBCR. If there is a misalignment, then I think you have more fundamental problems in how you approach your compliance. And companies have had time to course correct over the last couple of years. So I think as long as you have a understanding of what's in there and a common global script or a common script, because that information is consistent in various jurisdictions, I think you're in a good place. But just those numbers and a tick in the box, as opposed to not understanding them and having a script to explain them, is where the difference will be. So as long as you have that, I think you're in a good place.
Shobhan, you want to add something?
Yeah, so I think there's nothing called CBCR audits. What will happen is, we are already committed as part of the Action 13 report in the BEPS project that we would not do anything differently from what the rest of the world will do. And we are almost in the final stages of an internal guidance about appropriate use. OECD has already come out with its own appropriate use documents. So 2-3 things which I can, for the benefit of the audience, I can say is, one, we'll have some kind of a central committee or a central group of officers or a team which would have a look at the CBCRs, which we have already received, and draw up some risk parameters. Now, if based on those risk parameters, cases are picked up for scrutiny, then in those cases only, the transfer pricing officers would have access to CBCRs. Otherwise, nobody else, at this point, it is not being planned to provide access to anyone else other than the TPO. Because you see, the TPO would need access for various reasons, and primarily, as you know, that we can't use the CBCR to make a transfer pricing adjustment. That will just not hold water. So he has to make inquiries, as he does in his other audits also. So he has to look at the CBCR, frame his questions, and give that to the taxpayer for responses. So he will have access. And if in any case the TPO makes an adjustment merely by looking at some of the numbers in the CBCR, then as you know, we are committed that in a MAP meeting that would be considered. So I think there should not be too many concerns around it as to how it would be used. It would be exactly used in the manner as has been mandated for all countries across the globe. And our guidelines are almost in the final stages.
See, the way I see this is, if I were to bucket taxpayers into possibly 3 different buckets, there may be one set of taxpayers who have done the right thing in terms have done a transfer pricing study, have done benchmarking, have done documentation, reflecting, the transfer pricing based on what the business reality is. Then there is the other extreme of taxpayers who just set up, transfer pricing with no substance at all. And then you have the people in between possibly who are right to about 75, 80%, and the last another 20%, they've not been able to do it for maybe a variety of reasons because they felt it's not, significant, that needs a lot more, documentation, or they just have not had the bandwidth. The first set of people, I don't think there's an issue at all. Like Karthikeya was mentioning, you will need to, demonstrate in terms of why your pricing is in a particular manner. The only issue that may come up over there is, again, the transfer pricing officers might ask a lot more questions because now they have the benefit of a CBCR, having looked at, what kind of margins that you're getting in a different country. So that might need a little more effort in terms of engaging and explaining why a pricing or a, margin is different from jurisdiction X to jurisdiction Y. The expectation is that, again, if you're doing it right, you have the right basis for it, it will be accepted without, being just trying to make an adjustment just because the margins are different. The other extreme, where people have no substance, they are in deep trouble. They have to ensure that they make the changes. And like I said, gone are the days when you could just set up structures just to manage your effective tax rate, and this will now come out in the open. I think the people in the center is where they will need to possibly double up a little more effort in terms of getting, up to speed in terms of, setting things right for the things which they've not really, paid attention for. So that's the way I see it as you move forward of transfer pricing audits with the benefit of having a CBCR.
So if I can share some client experiences. So there have been clients, when they actually made the CBCR, they had a smile on their face because they themselves didn't know what it looked like, because when you yourself make individual document and you put that document together in one Excel sheet, it's surprising, right? It's really interesting one. What has happened is that, assuming everything is right, substance is in place, agreements are there, documentation is all right. But what the CBCR tells us is that clearly there are this optical risk which comes up. The optical risk which comes up is, and I applied it on myself, that if I have to apply a formulary apportionment, which Shobhan clearly says that that's something which they are not going to do, which is very good, you yourself could come out with 10 things which seems...
You can do that, but not only on the basis of the CBC.
Right, thank you. I thought the rule 10 was gone, but no, it's still alive. So you look at that and you yourself realize that this is an optical risk. This is going to raise more questions. I can tell you some of the clients have actually escalated their bilateral APA program within the company based on CBCR. If this is something, the questions I am anyway going to answer, and instead of 10 countries in the past, maybe 40 countries in the future, because you're going to have all the countries have the access to the CBCR, why not start engaging with the government and conclude some of these transactions in an APA? So I think that escalation has been, rather than just waiting, what are the questions which are going to come, worrying about what will I answer, moving fast on the journey and getting certainty is something I've seen with some of the clients.
So one of the things that we've been telling all our clients, especially the inbound ones, is that now that the filings have been done, one of the most obvious areas that any tax authority will look into, that which are the countries which are on India's value chain. So if you're importing goods into India or selling goods into another country, the countries that are there on your immediate value chain, what is the explanation for whatever margins are there in those countries? Because all those margins will now be evident in the CBCR, and that's the bit of homework that I would encourage all taxpayers to do, because that's the most obvious one any tax authority will ask. Shobhan, we see scenarios where countries are either doing simultaneous coordinated audits or joint audits. I understand that Italy and Germany have signed a protocol to do joint audits on a pilot basis. There is mutual administrative assistance treaty in the Nordic nations also where joint audits are happening. Do you see that that is something that India would be looking at in the near future?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure because I don't. There are various projects of the FTA, Forum on Tax Administration. Joint audits is one of those. I haven't dealt with it at all, and I'm not really aware of what's happening. But I don't see it immediately coming forth. We need to make some changes first before we can adopt that. As of now, the only joint thing, as I told you, was in our APA program, which is working very well. So I don't have a philosophical objection to joint audits, but I don't think we're ready for it. Or maybe somebody else in the CBDT knows it better. I'm not aware.
Okay. Let's talk about e-assessments. There was a CBDT instruction that came in February this year. Can you share with this audience, is there any framework that's been planned around e-assessments? How are they going to happen? How will cases be picked up for scrutiny? Will the notices come from a completely different geographic location? Anything that you can share with this audience on how e-assessments will happen?
Vipin, not that really I know because this is not an area in APA.
Okay.
The only thing that I know is that the work is on in the CBDT. Now, what is the progress, how long it's going to take, that I won't be able to comment anything on.
I was curious when it was part of our panel discussion because this is about dispute resolution. What makes you feel that e-assessments would help in dispute resolution? Because you see, what I think the CBDT wants to achieve is this individual face-to-face meetings between the taxpayer and the assessee has, somewhere down the line probably not been very efficient, maybe not been good enough. So they want to have an assessment procedure which is anonymous. Most of the replies would be filed through email and there will be some video conference. Then there will be a team of officers, not a single officer doing the assessment. But I couldn't really establish a connect between dispute resolution and e-assessments.
It was more from the point of view of not resolving a dispute, but the fear was that it might trigger
disputes.
Because, you may end up receiving a notice from a location where the experience on transfer pricing may not be of the same level as you see in some of the locations.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that is in any case happening today. I mean, we have transfer pricing officers across India taking different views on similar matters. So, and we are trying our best to streamline, and it will take some more time. Maybe the level of training, the level of engagement with the TPOs is not enough. Okay. But whether e-assessment per se would raise a bigger problem, I don't see it that way. But anyway, it's still in a stage. They're still planning out how they'll do it.
Right.
So let's see as it progresses.
Right. So Sanjay, my question to you is, if you have a wish list of what would be the new age dispute resolution measures and your experience in the Asia Pacific region as you engage with clients in the region or tax authorities in the region, what would be your wish list and what are those areas that we should look at in India?
So maybe let me start with TP and customs. Okay, so this has been a very interesting one. We have, so I've seen in Korea, they have advanced correlative adjustment, which means you can agree customs and transfer pricing in advance. So you're almost looking at a APA for both. And if one makes an adjustment, the other one gives credit for that, both ways. This is something UK started also. So I think I would look for that you hit two birds at one stone, and if that's something which we can bring in. And we've actually used it, right? In one of the APAs in 2018, we've used the customs SVB as a basis for concluding an APA. So that's one where you address two issues. The second one, I think something like block audit could be good because we keep doing the same thing again and again. It's the same 5 comparables we fight for 3 times. Why not fight it once and get 3 years assessment order at one go? And whether I want to go to tribunal, whether I want to do a map, whether I want to do whatever for resolving that, because if I'm not an APA, and not everyone is an APA, So even if you have 1,000 applications, there are still 3,000 people left outside. Maybe the pain could reduce, the stress in the system, both sides, could reduce. So I think these two are on the top of my mind, which could probably change the way we do things.
So before I respond, comment on what Sanjay said, I think the best way for dispute resolution is to prevent disputes. So I think one inflection point was instruction 3, which we issued in 2016. What was happening was, out of 15,000 odd 3CEB reports, we used to pick up almost 5,000 to 6,000 cases for audit. And the strike rate, was 50%. So 3,000 audits, 3,000 adjustments, which was huge litigation. So instruction 3 very subtly put it that, the number of cases to be picked up for audit itself has to go down. And it has gone down. I don't have the numbers, but I'm sure it has gone down. So, so that itself was the first stage of preventing the number of disputes that would first arise, and then we run after various dispute resolution programs to resolve it. So that was a big step by the CBDT. Regarding block audits, I think it has been in discussion for quite some time now. And personally, I have supported it always, and there is some traction in it within the CBDT. And one more point you made was customs and TP. It has always puzzled me why, world over it was not getting accepted. Very few countries do it even now. And the standard argument given is, customs and TP exist for different purposes. I just don't understand. It's the same taxpayer, same transaction, and two valuations. It just doesn't make sense.
And also the customs transfer pricing methods, while they don't have the 5 methods.
They don't have as elaborate a mechanism as we have.
Broadly, the spirit of the methods is still the same, right? More or less.
So in APA, as I said, APAs have been creative. So in APAs, we have made use of that also.
Maheshji, one question to you. What is your take on administrative settlements? Currently, our Income Tax Act doesn't have the ability to, we don't have the mechanism where a taxpayer can settle a dispute as it happens. One either goes through the judicial route or you invoke a map or something like that. Do you foresee India making an amendment to the Act to allow administrative settlements to happen?
That's a policy decision, which I think Shobhan should be able to say, because I think DRP was in that line, but it has not shaped up. But I think the talk is on. Let's see.
In your view, do you think it's worth considering as a
Definitely
as a measure?
yes. Definitely yes.
Definitely yes. Okay. So I think that's all we have for now. We are happy to take questions. I think we have another 8 or 10 minutes left in the session. So if there are any questions, I think the distinguished panel would be ready to take them.
Hi, my name is Prajakta. I have a question for Sanjay. He mentioned initially regarding the Brexit. So can you throw some light on it, how it will impact the transfer pricing, even though it's after Brexit, but still if you can elaborate it more.
So EU, just to give an example, so EU has a rule that goods which are not originated from UK will have higher tariffs. So food and beverages industry is the biggest one which has got impacted, because the exports from UK to EU are not originated from UK. So that is the industry which has a biggest impact in terms of the tariffs which EU will levy going forward. There's a 18-month transition period before Brexit becomes effective. So clearly they are all looking at supply chain, because at the end of the day, you won't change things because you don't want to pay duty. You will need to change things because the customer is not going to give you extra price because there's extra duty. So you may be forced to make changes to your supply chain to ensure that you don't end up paying that duty.
I think there are the point around that was it also depends on whether they will agree to do a soft Brexit or a hard Brexit, because UK at this point wants to do a soft Brexit. Whether they are able to achieve that or not, we do not know. But you could also be looking at a scenario where there is a Brexit, but UK continues to enjoy tariff protection and duty exemptions and so on as it used to be before. I think the other dimension of impact of Brexit, not on the supply chain side, but is that, investment structures into EU today enjoy participation exemption, for example, whether that's going to be available in the future for investments into UK or from the UK, and you might see investment structures changing because of that. But it's a little early to talk about it because we'll have to wait and see whether they do a soft Brexit or a hard Brexit and what takes shape.
And my another question is to Shobhan. Just wanted to know your experience as well dealing with the APA, bilateral APA with the European authorities. And while your discussion you mentioned that 70% of the APAs for the cost plus. But then how's your experience with other, like if the revenue share model is there, and what typically they look at whenever such cases comes?
Well, I have dealt with a number of countries. The way we negotiate cases is different because every country has its own approach towards APAs. But one takeaway from all these things have been that what I noted was the competent authorities of most treaty partners rely a lot on what the taxpayer provides or supplies to them. And they almost go by what the taxpayer has analyzed and produced before them. Whereas we, I don't know why, maybe it's a legacy issue, we don't accept the submissions of the taxpayers at face value at least. Even though we are running a very strong, no, it's the reality. And as I think Mahesh sir alluded, sometimes the information which we get probably does not reveal exactly the facts of the business. So, and this has been a big problem with the US. So what happens, I'll give an example. Let us say we are negotiating a simple cost plus case, and the taxpayer's economic analysis is around say 12 or 13%. And we have an analysis of our own which says 16%. Now, normally I would assume that we negotiate and find a settlement somewhere in between or at some number. But they would say, when the taxpayer has done such a robust analysis and found out comparables with this kind of a number, where is the question of deviating from that? And that puts us in a bit of a difficulty because we also believe in our own analysis, which my own commissioner has given to the Indian CA. So this is just a small example. We have resolved a number of complicated cases also, both with the US, recently with Denmark, we have done with Netherlands also, where the negotiating strategies of each country has been very different. I mean, each CA has his own way of negotiating a case. And all in all, we have had a very good experience. I mean, bilateral APAs are being resolved much quicker. And in fact, recently there was a taxpayer who came to me with a question that whether I should go for unilateral or bilateral, just on the timelines. I said on timelines, we are probably bilaterals are doing better than unilaterals because unilateral, some of the cases have gone into the 5th year for various reasons. Maybe the taxpayer was not supplying the information or whatever. So on the timeline front, if anyone has a concern that bilaterals, because two countries are involved, will take more time, I can assure you that that is not the case. There is absolutely no difference. In fact, it could be quicker doing a bilateral.
Just an observation. I hope the professionals must have put their views regarding dispute resolution mechanism and changes to be proposed, say for bringing block this thing or segregating TP only TP disputes rather than the corporate, because when these two mix up, a lot of energy is taken on the corporate tax issues, which have a truncated history. So I hope that the professionals representing the assessees and the corporates have made representations before the committee which is looking into the tax changes.
So we do our job in the forums, and as you heard someone, that they hear more the taxpayers than the professionals. So I would also encourage the taxpayers to continue to make those points.
I have a question here. Does the APA have any legal value? Can it be taken as a precedence and applied in other cases, or is it individual only?
Can an APA outcome be applied in other cases? I guess of some other
legal precedence, yes. That's from a legal point of view. If one decision is taken, can that be applied in another case? Do you publish your APAs?
No, so if you mean to say that one APA resolution could be applied in the case of another taxpayer, now if the facts are identical, FAR is similar, then maybe we can conclude an APA with the other taxpayer also on similar lines. But to have a blanket application of a similar agreement with a number of taxpayers, that probably is not.
And the APAs are not published?
No.
Okay.
And in any case, adding to what I said, the benefit is only with the precedence is only available with the revenue, not with the taxpayer. So that benefit of precedence only you all have.
I mean, that is how it should be. Because we read a lot in the media about cases getting resolved and everybody in the world knows about it.
Arun, on this I'll say one thing, that the benefit of precedence is there with the revenue, but when the applicant, when they come to me, they start with this, sir, these are the cases where we have already negotiated at this rate, sir, how would you go about it? So, in fact, that is many times the starting point of a discussion, which is not fair.
I think there was one question over there.
About renewal, is there any thought process on how taxpayers can ensure that the renewal can happen quickly? Because the amount of time that people have put in both sides, taxpayer as well as tax office, is significant. And that's in view of thinking that this will then continue in the next period and the period after. So if there is a way to do that, especially given the inventory that we are already sitting on.
Yeah, so there is definitely a thought process. We are working on some guidelines. Broadly, I can say only this much, that if the renewal application has exactly the same transactions which we have already resolved in the past APA, the FAR remains materially the same, and there are no significant changes to what has been done, then those applications would be fast-tracked. As you know, there is nothing called a renewal application in the Indian APA program, but so suppose we had done an APA on only software development, but in the renewal, the applicant comes up with two other transactions also. Now, I don't think that we can fast-track as we can do a case which is only the same transaction with the same FAR. So what we are planning for those cases, we haven't even identified how many of the renewal applications are exactly the same as it was in the past. And let me clarify that if the past was a unilateral and now it has come as a bilateral, that doesn't make any difference. It will be treated as a plain and simple renewal. So in those cases, what we are planning is we'll not do an extensive position paper kind of an exercise again, because we have just resolved the case. But a site visit would be done to validate that the FAR remains the same. Then the APA commissioner would be requested to come out with a paper, not an exhaustive position paper, but with relevant points saying that the FAR has been validated and the transaction remains primarily more or less the same. Those cases would be fast-tracked. They would not go into the inventory of our 900 odd cases.
That's really encouraging to know.
But we are still in a very nascent stage, because we need the taxpayers' help also, because many of the applications don't say anything in a covering letter or anything that it's the same transaction which we resolved in the last application. And merely by saying that I have just filed a renewal application, please do it quickly, will not help. So what the consultants and taxpayers need to do is go and engage with their commissioner and tell them that this is actually the same what we just inked a few months ago. Now, we need to identify these cases. I don't think there will be more than 40-50 cases of that category, which can be fast-tracked.
So we can take this offline, Shobhan, because one very recent experience was we had exactly same conversation, and the response was that while it makes a lot of sense to do it that way, however, the current mandate is to try and clear, which also is valid. Current mandate is to try and clear the past year inventory, and therefore we are not in position to take cases out of turn. So they are awaiting certain instructions or guidelines internally to come from above.
Yeah, that is being worked upon.
Okay.
So if you have a conversation with an APA commissioner, he would not know the full contours of that guidelines which is about to come out.
And okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Who lost?
On this APA, I'm just extending the discussion. The first APAs had been done with the limited sort of information which was available. There was office visit, and now you have CBCR, you have a lot of exchange of information, much more data available. So therefore, the renewal process definitely will just not be a cut and paste affair. There will be a lot more data which will be revisited before the renewal is concluded.
Well, I have nothing to say on that. It seems that you have already decided how the renewals are going to be approached.
Thank you. I think with that, we bring the session to a close. I want to thank the distinguished panel for such candid conversation. I think the insights were really very valuable. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bipin, and all the panelists for wonderful deliberations. We will have the next panel immediately. I request all the panelists to come up for a photograph, please. After lunch, we have again some